Sarah had nothing in this world but her dignity and a heart of pure gold. But when she found a dying man on a freezing sidewalk, a man the world called a beggar, she was forced to make a choice that would cost her the one thing she had left. To save his life, she would have to give up her virtue to a predatory monster. She had no idea that the poor man she sacrificed her soul for was the missing heir to a $10 billion empire, or that her act of selfless love was about to trigger a reveal that would leave the city's elite in absolute shock. The rain was cruel that night, turning the city streets into a dark, freezing ocean. The wind howled through the narrow gaps between the tall buildings, like it was laughing at those who had nowhere to go. Sarah walked home from her double shift at the diner, her legs feeling like heavy lead. Her shoes were thin, with holes in the soles that allowed the icy water to soak her socks with every step. Her coat was threadbare, its fabric worn through at the elbows, a relic from a life that had always been a struggle. Sarah was 22, an orphan who had grown up in a world defined by the word not enough. She remembered her childhood clearly, sharing a single cramped room with other children, sharing one old, itchy blanket, and eating nothing but plain rice and beans every single day. She had learned to count every penny and to stretch every meal until there was nothing left but hope. But she had also learned that character is not found in a bank account. Her mother's voice, soft and tired, still whispered in her mind, "Sarah, kindness comes from the heart, no matter the cost." As she walked, she passed the Williams Theatre. It looked like a palace made of gold, every window blazing with bright, cheerful light that made the rain look like falling diamonds. Through the glass doors, she saw people dressed in clothes more expensive than any dream she had ever had. Women in sparkling dresses and men in perfect black suits laughed and talked, protected from the storm by thick walls and even thicker wallets. Sarah felt the cold biting at her skin, but she pulled her thin coat tighter and kept walking, her wet shoes squeaking rhythmically on the broken pavement. Then she saw him. In the shadows of a dark, narrow alley, hidden behind an overflowing dumpster, a man lay collapsed against a cold brick wall. He was thin, scary, thin. His face was pale as a ghost, and his clothes were torn and caked with the city's filth. He was shivering so violently it seemed his very bones might break into pieces. His breathing was thin and ragged, like a dying candle flickering in its last moments. This was Julian. To the rest of the world, he was just a discarded soul, a blemish on the city's face. A group of wealthy people coming from the theater walked by just then. A man in a tailored navy suit looked at Julian and wrinkled his nose in visible disgust. "Disgusting," he spat to his companion, pulling his jacket closer, as if poverty were a disease he could catch. "The city should clean up these street rats before they ruin the view." They walked away, laughing about their perfect evening, leaving the man in the mud. But Sarah didn't walk away. She knelt in the freezing mud, pulling Julian's head into her lap and ignoring the dirt staining her only good dress. She looked into his eyes and didn't see a beggar. She saw a human being whose time was running out. She didn't know she was holding the most powerful man in the city. She only knew he was dying, and she was the only one who had stopped to help. Sarah didn't hesitate for a single second. She dropped to her knees, the freezing grey mud soaking into the fabric of her only good dress. But she didn't care about the stains. She pulled the man's head into her lap, cradling him as if he were a precious child, rather than a stranger the world had discarded. The grime of the alley covered her hands, but her only focus was the flickering life in her arms. "Please," Julian whispered again. His voice was so thin it was almost swallowed by the sound of the rain hitting the trash cans. Sarah leaned closer and felt a chill run down her own spine. His lips weren't just cold. They had turned a scary shade of blue-purple, the color of someone whose heart was struggling to keep the fire of life burning. He looked up at her with eyes that held a terrifying mixture of hope and deep shame. The man was shivering so violently that it felt like his whole body might just break into pieces. His teeth chattered with a rhythmic metallic sound, and every breath he took came out in a small, ragged cloud that vanished into the darkness. Sarah wrapped her arms around him, trying to share her own body heat, but she was shivering too. She knew that if she didn't move him soon, the cold would win. She reached into her threadbare pockets, searching for anything that could help. Her fingers brushed against a small, hard object. It was her grandmother's ring, a thin gold band with a tiny clouded stone. It was the only heirloom she possessed, the only piece of her family she had left in this world. She looked at the ring, then at the dying man. She knew she could sell it to pay for a doctor, but it felt like giving away her last bit of soul. Still, she gripped it tight. Life, she decided, was worth more than gold. Desperate, Sarah pulled Julian toward the edge of the sidewalk, hoping to catch a ride to the clinic. A bright yellow taxi slowed down, but when the driver saw Sarah's mud-stained dress and the beggar she was dragging, his face twisted in disgust. He stepped on the gas and sped away, splashing icy water all over them. 2 more cars did the same, their drivers looking at the pair as if they were street rats who would ruin their clean upholstery. Sarah was beginning to lose hope when an old man carrying a heavy broom appeared from the shadows of a nearby building. He had a kind, tired face and eyes that had clearly seen much suffering. It was Mr. Peter, the caretaker of a small nearby shop. He didn't ask for money or look at their dirty clothes with judgment. "He looks bad, child," Mr. Peter said softly. Without being asked, he put his rough, strong arm under Julian's shoulder, helping Sarah lift him. "There is a small clinic 3 blocks away. Let's get him there before the light goes out in his eyes." The clinic was a small, squat building that smelled of floor wax and the sharp, clinical sting of disinfectant. It was a place meant for healing, but as Sarah and Mr. Peter hurried through the sliding doors, the air felt as cold as the rain outside. They laid Julian on a narrow gurney in the hallway, his skin now the color of gray ash. Sarah rushed to the front desk, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands trembling as she reached for the bell. The receptionist, a woman with hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her eyes into thin slits, didn't even look up at first. She was busy filing her nails, the rhythmic scritch-scritch sound the only noise in the quiet lobby. When she finally lifted her gaze, her eyes moved over Sarah's mud-caked dress and Mr. Peter's worn work clothes with a look of pure, unadulterated disdain. It was the same look the wealthy theater-goers had given Julian in the alley, the look that said they were looking at garbage, not human beings. "We don't take walk-ins from the street after hours," she said, her voice as flat and hard as a paving stone. Sarah pleaded, explaining that the man was dying, but the woman simply pointed to a sign on the wall, regarding proof of insurance or immediate deposit. A doctor finally emerged from the back, a man named Dr. Aris, with tired eyes and a heavy brow. He performed a quick, silent examination of Julian right there on the gurney. When he stood up, his face was grave. "He has severe internal hemorrhaging," the doctor whispered, loud enough only for Sarah to hear. "He won't make it through the next 2 hours without emergency surgery. His heart is already starting to falter." "Then save him!" Sarah cried, her voice breaking. "Please, save him!" The doctor looked at the floor, then at the receptionist. "The surgery is complex. The cost, including the specialized equipment and the surgical team, is $10,000. The clinic policy is absolute. We need a cash deposit before we can move him to the operating theater." $10,000. To Sarah, that amount might as well have been 10 million. She thought of her grandmother's ring in her pocket, a tiny bit of gold that might fetch $100 if she was lucky. She looked at Julian, whose eyes were fluttering, his hand reaching out weakly in the air as if searching for something to hold on to. She knew there was only one person in the city who could produce that kind of money instantly, her former employer, the real estate mogul, Mr. Sterling. Sterling was a man who lived in a world of marble floors and sparkling chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls from his ceilings. His office was a palace of glass and steel where he made deals that changed the shape of the city's skyline. Sarah had worked for him as a junior clerk until she was fired for lacking the right image. She ran through the rain, her lungs burning, until she reached the gates of his high-rise. When she was finally allowed into his office, the contrast was unbearable. Sterling sat behind a desk made of dark, expensive wood, a glass of amber whiskey in his hand. He looked at Sarah, dripping wet, shivering, and desperate, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. 10,000 for a beggar, Sarah? He laughed, the sound echoing off the cold marble. Why should I waste my resources on a discarded soul? Because he is a person, she whispered. Sterling stood up, walking around the desk to stand inches from her. He looked at her beauty, which even the rain and mud couldn't hide. I will pay the bill, he said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, smooth, low. I will save your street rat, but I don't give gifts for free. You know what I want. You stay with me tonight and the surgery begins now. If you leave, he dies. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. She looked at his cold, calculating eyes and realized that the monster in front of her was far more dangerous than the death waiting for Julian in the clinic. Sarah stood in the center of the glass-walled office, the silence ringing in her ears like a physical blow. Mr. Sterling's predatory smile didn't waver. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a contract that felt more like a death warrant than a legal document. Sarah's hands were so cold she could barely feel her fingers. She closed her eyes for a second, and in that darkness, she heard her mother's voice again. It was the same soft, tired voice from the tiny apartment of her youth. Sarah, kindness comes from the heart, no matter the cost. Her mother had never imagined a cost like this, but Sarah knew that a human life was hanging in the balance. If she walked out now, Julian's light would go out forever. She took the pen Sterling offered. It felt heavy, like it was made of lead. Her vision blurred with hot, stinging tears as she looked at the lines of text she didn't even bother to read. She only saw the space at the bottom for her signature. With a shaking hand, she signed her name. It was done. She had sold her soul to save a man she barely knew, a man the world had discarded like a broken toy. As she stood there, a silent scream echoed inside her mind. She was giving up her dignity, her virtue, the one thing she had left in this world, and she was doing it for a beggar who had nothing to give her back. No gratitude, no money, no future. She truly believed she was throwing her life away into a dark pit for a ghost. The hours that followed were a nightmare. Sterling's mansion was a place of cold marble and expensive shadows. Sarah endured the night with a heart that felt like it had turned to stone. She didn't look at the golden frames on the walls or the silk sheets. She only stared at the ceiling, counting the minutes until the dawn. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of shame. A street girl, losing the only thing that made her feel valuable. Every second felt like an eternity, and the air in the room felt too thick to breathe. When the first grey light of morning finally touched the windows, Sterling stood by the edge of the bed, his face showing no mercy. He reached into a small safe and pulled out a thick envelope. With a sneer that made his face look like a mask of malice, he threw the envelope of cash at Sarah's feet. "There is your 10,000, you little rat," he spat, Go save your beggar. But remember, after tonight, you are nothing but trash. Don't ever think you belong in a world like this." The bills scattered across the expensive rug, and Sarah knelt to gather them, her fingers trembling so much she could barely grip the paper. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just held the money against her chest, as if it were Julian's very heart. She ran out of the mansion and into the early morning dark. The rain had slowed to a freezing drizzle, but the wind was still sharp. Sarah ran until her lungs burned, and her legs felt like they would collapse. She didn't notice that her hands were bleeding from where she had scraped them against Sterling's gate, or that her shoes were finally falling apart. Her soul was hurting in a way that no medicine could fix. She arrived at the clinic as the sun began to rise, a broken girl carrying the price of a life in a stained envelope. She had made the ultimate sacrifice, and as she handed the money to the stunned receptionist, she felt as though her own life had ended so that Julian's could begin. Sarah handed the stained envelope to the receptionist, her fingers still numb from the cold and the trauma. The woman, who had earlier looked at her like she was a street rat that didn't belong in a respectable place, now stared in absolute shock at the thick stack of bills. There was no time for apologies or explanations. Dr. Aris appeared immediately, his face grave as he looked at the monitors. "His heart is faltering," he whispered to the nurses. Julian was rushed into the operating theater just minutes before his light would have gone out forever, his breathing so thin it barely stirred the air. Then began the long, hollow silence. Sarah sat in a hard plastic chair in the far corner of the waiting room, her body feeling heavy and disconnected, like a house with no one living inside. For 12 long hours she remained there, a broken girl, in a room full of strangers who looked through her as if she were invisible. She felt like a ghost, a discarded soul who had traded her own light to keep a stranger's fire burning in the dark. Every time the clock on the wall ticked, it sounded like a hammer hitting a nail, reminding her of the night that had just passed. She eventually retreated to the hospital bathroom, seeking the only refuge she could find. The fluorescent lights were harsh, showing every tear streak on her pale, exhausted face. She turned the water as hot as she could stand, and began to scrub her skin with a desperate intensity. She used the cheap, industrial soap until her hands were red and raw, trying to wash away the memory of Mr. Sterling's mansion and his cold, predatory eyes. She thought of her mother's words about kindness, but now they felt heavy, like stones sitting at the bottom of her heart. She wondered if she would ever feel clean again, or if the price she had paid would be a mark she carried forever. The sun was high in the sky, painting the city in shades of gold, when Dr. Aris finally walked through the double doors. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were soft as they found Sarah waiting in her corner. "He survived," the doctor said, his voice quiet with genuine wonder. "It was a miracle. He is a fighter, but he only made it because someone was brave enough to pay the price for a life the world had already given up on." Sarah let out a breath she had been holding for a lifetime, her knees nearly giving way under the weight of the relief. She was finally allowed into the recovery ward, a quiet room that smelled of medicine and new beginnings. She sat by Julian's bed, looking at him properly for the first time without the grime of the alley covering his face. He was pale, but his breathing was now steady and deep, like someone falling asleep after a long, tiring day. As his eyelids flickered, she noticed the shape of his jaw and his thick, dark hair. When he finally opened his eyes for a fleeting second, she saw a shade of piercing green that looked strangely familiar, like a song she couldn't quite remember the name of. Sarah did not leave his side for a single moment. She held his rough, cracked hand, the hand of a man the world called a beggar, and whispered stories of her own life to his unconscious ears. She talked about her dreams of a better life, and the faith she had that dreams could still come true. She treated this nameless man like an honored guest, the most important person in her world, unaware that she was sitting beside the missing king of the city. She believed her sacrifice was a secret that would be buried with her, never knowing that her act of selfless love was about to change everything. The quiet of the public recovery ward was shattered at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The heavy double doors didn't just open. They burst apart as if hit by a sudden violent storm. 4 tall men in sharp black suits, their faces like carved stone, marched in first to clear a path. Behind them stepped a woman whose very presence seemed to make the hospital's dim fluorescent lights look like cheap imitations of the sun. She was draped in a silk coat the color of midnight, and the diamonds at her throat sparkled like 1,000 trapped stars. This was Mrs. Eleanor Vane, the matriarch of the city's most powerful dynasty. Sarah stood up from her hard plastic chair, her heart leaping into her throat as she smoothed her mud-stained hem. She felt a surge of terror, looking like a ghost about to fade away. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He's still very weak." But the woman didn't even see Sarah. She fell to her knees beside the bed, her movements dramatic and perfectly timed. "My son," she sobbed into the thin hospital blanket. "Julian, we have found you. The Vane heir is safe at last." Behind the mother came 2 others, Julian's brother, Marcus, and his sister, Beatrice. They didn't kneel. Instead, they stood at the foot of the bed, looking around the public ward with expressions of pure, unadulterated disgust. Beatrice pulled a silk handkerchief from her purse and held it over her nose. "The smell in this place is unbearable," she sneered, her eyes flicking toward the grey linoleum floor. "How could a Vane be kept in a gutter like this? It's a disgrace to our name." Marcus nodded, checking his gold watch. "We need him moved to the private wing immediately. This filth is a health hazard." Then Beatrice's eyes landed on Sarah. The warmth of the room seemed to drop by 20 degrees. "And who is this?" she asked, her voice dropping into a sharp, icy blade. She looked at Sarah's tangled hair and the dark circles under her eyes. "Are you a maid, or perhaps one of those street girls looking for a handout?" She stepped closer, her perfume thick and cloying. "I know your kind. You find a man in trouble and you hang on like a leech, hoping for a reward." "I'm not... I was just helping," Sarah stammered, feeling the weight of her secret sacrifice pressing down on her soul. She felt like trash in the presence of such polished wealth. Mrs. Vane finally looked up, her eyes dry and calculating despite the sobbing. "Helping?" She laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "My son was kidnapped by rivals and left for dead. If you've been near him, you're likely part of the plot. Security." She barked at the men in the hallway. "Throw this street girl out. She doesn't belong in the same room as a Vane." The large men moved forward, their heavy shoes thudding on the floor. One of them reached for Sarah's arm, gripping her roughly, just as Julian's siblings had always done to those they deemed nobody. But Sarah didn't run. She reached into her threadbare pocket and pulled out a single crumpled piece of paper. With a hand that shook but did not fail, she held it out. "I paid for the surgery," she said, her voice small but clear. "Here is the receipt, $10,000. Cash." The room went into a terrible, heavy silence. Marcus froze. Beatrice's sneer vanished. Mrs. Vane took the paper with 2 fingers, reading the name of the clinic and the paid in full stamp. They looked at the girl in the ruined dress, then at the massive sum on the paper, and realized that this street rat held a piece of their son's life that they could not simply buy back. The silence that followed Sarah's revelation was so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife. Mrs. Vane held the crumpled receipt for $10,000 between 2 manicured fingers. her eyes darting from the paid-in-full stamp to the exhausted girl standing before her. Marcus and Beatrice stood like statues, their faces frozen in a mask of confusion and growing irritation. The air in the public ward was no longer filled with the sharp scent of Eleanor's expensive perfume. It was filled with the heavy, clinical weight of a truth they weren't prepared to handle. Just as Beatrice opened her mouth to claim the receipt was surely a forgery, a rhythmic, frantic beeping began to echo from the heart monitor beside the bed. The beggar Julian, the man who had been a ghost in his own body for days, began to move. His head turned slowly on the thin hospital pillow, and his eyelids flickered with a painful effort. The room went dead silent as his eyes finally opened, revealing a shade of piercing green that seemed to hold the weight of every secret in the city. He looked at the ceiling, then at the blurred faces of his family, his breath coming in shallow, raspy gasps like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Eleanor Vane let out a cry of genuine relief, rushing to the side of the bed. "Julian, my darling boy, you're back," she sobbed, reaching out to wrap her arms around him, her diamonds catching the harsh fluorescent light. Marcus and Beatrice moved forward too, their faces suddenly shifting into rehearsed expressions of brotherly and sisterly love. But Julian didn't look at his mother. He didn't look at his brother's outstretched hand or his sister's tearless eyes. With a strength that defied the doctor's predictions, he reached past his family, his trembling arm searching the air until his fingers found Sarah's rough, cracked hand. He gripped her with a desperation that silenced the entire room, pulling her closer to his side. She was the only one," Julian whispered, his voice a low, broken rasp that carried through the ward like a prayer. He looked at his mother, his gaze cold and accusing. "Everyone else walked past me in that alley. They saw a beggar and turned their heads, but she saw me when I was invisible. She stayed when the world had already buried me." Sarah felt her heart hammer against her ribs, her fingers intertwined with the hand of the man she had sacrificed her soul to save. She felt small in the presence of the Vanes, but in Julian's eyes, she saw that she was the only person who truly existed. Julian took a shuddering breath and looked at his brother, Marcus. "The kidnapping wasn't a random act of street violence," he said, his voice gaining a terrifying clarity. "It was the rivals, the Sterling group. They wanted the board to think I was dead so they could trigger the hostile takeover of the Vane legacy. They left me in that alley to rot, thinking no one would ever stop for a man who looked like trash." The family gasped, the realization hitting them that their billion-dollar empire had almost been lost because of the very man Sarah had begged to save. The beggar was not just an heir, he was the primary shield protecting their entire fortune. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the room transformed. The vultures began to change their feathers. Beatrice, who had just minutes ago called Sarah a leech, stepped forward with a fake wide smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, you poor, brave girl," she cooed, reaching out to touch Sarah's shoulder. "We had no idea. You've saved our family. Please forgive our earlier stress. We were just so worried about our brother." Marcus nodded quickly, his voice turning warm and patronizing. "Yes, we must reward you properly. Name your price, dear." They spoke to her as if she were a hero, but Sarah could feel the underlying coldness. They didn't see a person, they saw a debt that needed to be settled. Julian, however, was still watching Sarah. He saw the way she flinched at Beatrice's touch. He saw the red, raw skin of her hands, where she had scrubbed them until they bled. But most of all, he saw the unbearable sadness hidden deep in her dark eyes, a hollow, haunted look that wasn't there when she first found him in the alley. He knew her heart was pure, and he sensed that something terrible had happened to get that $10,000. His blood turned cold as he realized that while he had been sleeping, The woman he now held onto had paid a price for his life that went far beyond money. He squeezed her hand tighter, a silent promise forming in his mind. He would find the monster who had dimmed her light, and he would make the world pay for every tear she had shed. The morning sun filtered through the hospital windows, but the atmosphere in the room remained as cold as a tomb. Julian had refused to let go of Sarah's hand, his green eyes fixed on her with a protective intensity that made the rest of his family shrink into the corners of the ward. At exactly 9 a.m., a tall man in his 50s with grey hair and kind eyes, behind sharp glasses, entered. He carried a leather briefcase that looked heavy with the weight of 1,000 secrets. This was Edward Miller, the Vane family's lead counsel for over 20 years. He didn't look at the diamonds Eleanor wore or the scowling faces of the siblings. He walked straight to Julian. "Mr. Vane," Edward said, his voice a calm, professional hum. "I have begun the investigation into the accident. We have identified the vehicle that forced you off the road." Julian's grip on Sarah's hand tightened. "Edward," Julian rasped, "never mind the car for a moment. Look at this receipt." He gestured to the crumpled clinic paper Eleanor was still holding. "This girl paid $10,000 in cash to save my life when I was a beggar. I want to know where that money came from. She is an orphan with no savings." Sarah's heart stopped. She tried to pull her hand away, her face burning with a shame that felt like a physical weight. "It doesn't matter," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're alive. That's all I wanted." But Edward Miller was already looking at the paid in full stamp. He looked at Sarah's raw, scrubbed hands, and then at Julian. "Sir," Edward said quietly, "I noticed a black Mercedes belonging to the Sterling Group parked downstairs. Mr. Sterling himself is in the lobby, claiming he is here to check on a former employee." Julian's blood turned to ice. He looked at Sarah, seeing the way she flinched at the mention of Sterling's name. The truth hit him like a physical blow. He didn't see a girl who had lost her virtue. He saw the bravest act of sacrifice he had ever known. He didn't shout. He didn't scream. He simply looked at Edward and said, "Bring him up. Tell him there is a reward for his generosity, and bring the police." 10 minutes later, the door swung open. Mr. Sterling walked in, a predatory smile on his face, his expensive shoes clicking arrogantly on the linoleum. He looked at Sarah and winked, a gesture of pure malice. "I see the street rat survived." Sterling laughed, looking at Julian. "I expect my investment to be returned with interest, Vane." The room went deathly silent. Edward Miller stepped forward, opening his briefcase to reveal a digital recording and a copy of the cruel contract Sarah had signed. "Mr. Sterling," Edward said, his voice like a falling axe, "we have evidence that your group orchestrated Julian's kidnapping to trigger a hostile takeover. Furthermore, this contract you forced a desperate woman to sign is not a debt." Sterling's face went from tanned to a sickly shade of grey. The police stepped out from behind the curtain, their handcuffs rattling with a final metallic sound. As they dragged the screaming mogul out of the room, Julian turned his gaze toward the doorway. He pointed a trembling finger at the clinic receptionist, who had called him a street rat only days before. "And you," Julian said, his voice cold and commanding. "Pack your things. You no longer work for this clinic, because as of 5 minutes ago, I own it." Justice had arrived, and it was only just beginning. Julian led Sarah out of the public ward, his arm wrapped firmly around her shoulders as if he were shielding a rare treasure from a storm. Outside, the black Mercedes was waiting, its engine humming like a sleeping beast. The doorman at the hospital, who had ignored Sarah for days, now bowed so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. They drove through the city to the Golden Palace Hotel, the most expensive building in the country. As they walked into the lobby, The hotel staff looked at Sarah's ruined shoes and mud-stained dress with visible judgment. But when Julian placed his black credit card on the marble counter and demanded the presidential suite, their faces went pale and their attitudes changed in an instant. Once they were inside the suite, a place of sparkling chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows, Julian had his staff bring in racks of the finest silk dresses and softest cashmere coats. But Sarah stood in the center of the room, looking like a ghost in a palace. She shook her head, her voice a small whisper. "I don't want the fancy silks, Julian. I didn't save you because I wanted a reward. I only wanted you to live." She felt out of place among the wealth, still carrying the heavy weight of the shame Mr. Sterling had forced upon her. Just then, the door opened, and Eleanor Vane entered. She didn't look like the powerful queen from before. Her eyes were red from crying, and she looked small. She walked straight to Sarah and took her rough, cracked hands. "I came to really apologize and mean it," Eleanor said, her voice cracking with genuine regret. Julian then turned to Sarah and handed her a leather folder. "I bought the clinic where they treated us," he said firmly. "The signs are being changed today. It is no longer a place that turns away the poor. It is now the Sarah Mercy Center, a free hospital for anyone the world has forgotten." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she realized that her night of darkness had created a permanent light for others. Later that afternoon, Julian insisted on one more stop. The limousine moved slowly through the city until it reached the dark, narrow alley where Sarah had first found him in the mud. They sat in the back of the car, the expensive leather seats a sharp contrast to the cold brick walls outside the window. Julian looked at the spot where he had almost died, and then back at Sarah. "They tried to make you feel like trash, but you are the person who taught me what real strength is," he said softly. He took her hand and asked her not just to be his friend, but his true partner in running the Vane Charitable Foundation. "I want you to be the voice for the invisible," he promised. Sarah looked out at the rain, which no longer felt cruel, and finally felt the heaviness in her soul begin to lift. 10 years passed, like a river flowing toward a peaceful ocean. The city still had its towering glass buildings and its occasional cruel storms, but for Sarah and Julian, the world looked entirely different. They lived in a house that was large and beautiful, yes, but it was not a museum of cold marble. It was a home. It was a place where the hallways echoed with the sound of children's laughter, and the kitchen always smelled of warm vanilla and fresh bread. They had built their life not on the strength of a bank account, but on a foundation of mutual respect and the memory of a sacrifice that had changed them both forever. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Julian stood by the large windows of their living room, watching their 2 children, a 9-year-old boy named Leo and a 7-year-old girl named Maya. They were in the garden, helping Mr. Peter, the old caretaker who had once helped Sarah in the rain, plant new rose bushes. Julian turned to Sarah, who was sitting on the sofa, her face glowing with a quiet, hard-won peace. He realized that the children weren't just playing, they were learning. They didn't ask for the most expensive toys or designer clothes. Instead, they asked if they could bring extra sandwiches to the people working at the gate. Sarah had taught them the most important lesson of all, that love and character are worth more than any stuff the world tries to sell you. The Sarah Mercy Center had grown from a small clinic into a massive foundation that helped thousands of invisible people every year. It was a place where no one was ever called a street rat, and no one was turned away because of their clothes. Sarah spent 3 days a week there, not as a boss, but as a friend to the lonely. She knew their names, their stories, and the specific way they liked their tea. She had become the voice for the people the rest of the city chose to walk past. She often told the volunteers, Never judge a soul by its covering, for you never know when you are holding a king in your arms. Later that day, Sarah drove alone to the quiet cemetery on the outskirts of town. She carried a bouquet of fresh white lilies, her mother's favorite. She knelt by the modest headstone and cleared away a few stray leaves. "I did it, Mama," she whispered, her voice steady and clear. "I kept my heart open, even when the world tried to close it. I am enough." She thought back to that night in the rain, the night she believed her soul had been tarnished to save a stranger. She realized now that her dignity had never been something a monster like Mr. Sterling could take. It was something she had proven through her choice to put another person's life above her own. Julian joined her at the grave, placing a hand on her shoulder. He looked at his wife and saw the same light from within that had guided him out of the darkness in that narrow alley a decade ago. He knew that while his money had built the buildings, her spirit had built the legacy. As for Mr. Sterling, he had long ago been stripped of his fortune and his freedom, a man who died in the same kind of cold isolation he once forced upon others. Karmic justice had been served, but it was the love in the garden that truly mattered now. As the sun set, painting the horizon in shades of deep gold and purple, the family sat together on their porch. They watched the city lights begin to twinkle like 1,000 stars. They were a family that had been broken apart by greed and lies, but they had been mended by the simplest, most powerful thing in the universe, a stranger's mercy. I hope you enjoyed this journey as much as I enjoyed creating it for you. It is a reminder that no matter how dark the night, your kindness is a light that can never be put out.